Starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar on regulatory options for automated vehicles. My name is Rosemary Patterson and I'll be your moderator today. Please feel free to contact me if you have any webinar-related inquiries. Our primary moderator, Jerome Carslake, is from ARB, and welcome, Jerome. Jerome is manager, sorry. You want to say hi?
I was going to say, yes, hi, good afternoon, everyone.
Awesome. Jerome is manager, National Road Safety Partnership Program, Safe Systems Engineering at ARB. The webinar will run for approximately 30 to 40 minutes, and there'll be 20 minutes for questions, or around about that. We're pretty flexible. We want to hear from the audience. We'll be recording the session today, so I'll email you the link following the presentation. We welcome any questions you have at any time, but we have some to ask you. You can type questions, answers or comments into the questions box. If you experience any technical glitches, please use the raise your hand function. Our presenter today is James Williams, Policy Manager, National Transport Commission. So welcome everyone, welcome James and Jerome. And Jerome, could you introduce James to our audience and also tell us a little bit about ADVI?
Thank you very much there, Rosemary. Well, it's a pleasure to have James here today. But first, to let you guys know about ADVI, basically the program is led and coordinated by ARB. The ADVI is a cooperative partnership program comprising of more than 50 Australian and international organisations. It's funded by a range of governments, industry and academic research partners, and its role is to accelerate the safe and successful introduction of driverless vehicles into Australian roads. I chair and lead the Policy Risk Group, which is just one of the pillars within ADVI, and I'm very proud today to have James Williams from the National Transport Commission. He's going to be talking to us about the upcoming regulatory paper that he's been talking around the country on. So welcome, James.
Thanks, Jerome. It's a great pleasure to be here. And welcome everyone listening. So today's webinar, we thought it would be a great opportunity to introduce you to an NTC project, which we're very excited about, regulatory barriers to automated vehicles. Provide you with a bit of an overview of the discussion paper that was published in May this year. And then we'd like to get into a little bit of detail and discussion with you about where people think the role of government should sit with automated vehicles. And that really is a key question that we're contemplating at the moment. So it'd be great to get your feedback on that. And then we'll take you through the substance of today's webinar, which are the regulatory options that we're putting up for discussion and for feedback from the community. And then we'll finish off with a look at the timing of proposed reforms. I might start though with introducing listeners to the NTC. The National Transport Commission is a national reform body. We're independent, funded by the Commonwealth and States and Territories of Australia, and our objective is to achieve national transport policy reforms, both in the realms of road, rail and intermodal transport. So, in essence, our task is to ensure that we never face the multiple gauge issue that Australia historically faced in rail across the national transport task. One of our key focus areas is technology, and in particular, understanding how we can unlock the benefits of technology in a regulatory and policy sense. This is this project looking at automated vehicles really is a flagship project for the NTC. It's a very important project. What we're trying to do here is to understand how the current regulations can support or indeed are barriers to vehicle automation, both for road and rail vehicles. And in response to that, how we can support a nationally consistent regulatory framework for automated vehicles. We've got a few project milestones up there on the screen. You'll see that the timeframes are very ambitious, they're compressed, they're accelerated. 4th of July 2016, our discussion paper, which is out at the moment, submissions close for that, and welcome and encourage submissions. After we've received those submissions and undertake any further legislative or policy analysis and research as required, we will then be going back to the Transport and Infrastructure Council in November of this year, and that council really is the the meeting of transport and infrastructure ministers, again at the Commonwealth, state and territory level, and local government, and that includes both planning, transport infrastructure ministers. So they'll be considering our reform recommendations that we'll be putting up to them, and then based on their feedback and approval, we'll then commence, and when I say we, I refer to both the NTC and any other organisations involved in the reform process, and go from there, working very closely with industry and the community, because we do need to take everyone with us, and what, as you can imagine, is really quite an important reform space.
James, can I just jump in for 2 seconds?
Please.
Thank our audience very much for letting us know that there has been a bit of background noise, and we hope we've fixed it now. Please let us know if it's not fixed. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. So that's the background to the NTC and this project. I'll now have a quick overview of the discussion paper itself. There it is there, the discussion paper, May 2016, Regulatory Options for Automated Vehicles. It's available on the NTC website. If you Google NTC Australia, you'll quickly find our website, and then if you go under current projects, you'll find the document very easily. It's accompanied with an executive summary as a separate document, and it's accompanied with the legislative analysis that we've undertaken as background material for those of you that are interested. And as I said, submissions due 4th of July. It's very important when thinking about reforms to think about the scenarios that we're preparing for, and we have 3. The first scenario is on-road trials and demonstrations, which we think are critical to the introduction of automated vehicles, not only understanding the impact of automated vehicles on our driving task and traffic conditions, but also the role of infrastructure, and also I think community perceptions and community understanding about automated vehicles is going to be very important. So we want to look at how we can support on-road trials and testing the technology on Australian roads. And whether there are any barriers there that need to be addressed. We also need to think about vehicles with conditional automation. And what I mean by that is vehicles that still require an element of a human driver as part of the driving task. So whether that means the driver has to monitor the vehicle's operating system while the vehicle's doing the automation, or whether the human driver needs to ensure that the vehicle comes to a safe stop for whatever reason. The human driver, is still in the loop. And you'll see when we look at the issues coming up that has very different, not only safety issues, but also regulatory and policy complexities and issues different to the last category there, which are vehicles with high or full automation, and that is automated vehicles where the automated driving system controls the vehicle, but not only that, all aspects of the vehicle have been undertaken by the automated vehicle, the driving system, either all the time or for defined periods. So they're the 3 scenarios that we're looking at. You'll notice there's no mention of a particular application. We don't talk about valet parking or platooning or autopilot or lane keeping because there's specific applications. We think, and would like your views on this, we think that it's actually the categorisation that matters from a regulatory or policy perspective are really that distinction between whether there's a human driver in control and responsible for the vehicle or something else. So that's why we talk about effectively using the SAE International Standard J3016, that taxonomy, that classification of automated vehicles based on that relationship between the human and the machine, more so than particular applications. Having said that, the applications matter, and that's our aim, is to make sure that we phase regulatory reforms in step with the technology, as it says there, not just in step with the technology as it advances and prepares for commercial large-scale deployment, but also ensuring that it's in step with market maturity as well. I'll just move on now to the role of government, and as I said in the opening comments, this is really a key issue for us and something that we would really appreciate some feedback on. We released an issues paper in February this year, which was a scoping document and asking some initial questions about what people thought the issues were for automated vehicles. And we asked about the role of government, and the answer, and you can see the submissions on the NTC website, the answers were fairly consistent. We don't want more red tape. We don't want unnecessary regulation, but governments have to make sure vehicles are safe. So our challenge is navigating through that and really ensuring we have a balance. So we are in the space of road safety, and it is very important that if an automated vehicle comes onto the market, it's only on those roads that are fit for purpose or operating in infrastructure or network environment that's appropriate and safe for that vehicle. So if you have a passenger shuttle, a low-speed passenger pod of some description, you wouldn't want to see that on the freeway. Likewise, you wouldn't want to see autopilot necessarily operating on the back streets. So it's about what's fit for purpose and what's safe. But what's the role of government? Probably the answer is it depends on what the issue is, I would suggest. So in this diagram here, we've got issues in the centre, 9 issues. These issues are what is effectively addressed in the discussion paper, and our regulatory options and the discussion around that follows based on those what's in those circles. So that includes things like what does control mean, who's in control, who's liable if something goes wrong, understanding the meaning of driver and so forth, privacy, liability. The point of this diagram is really to say we've got a bunch of issues. We can respond to it in a very light touch approach, which is industry self-regulation, that purple bar at the top left, or we could do case-by-case exemptions, industry-led codes of practice, right through to national guidelines led by governments, legislative solutions, and then ultimately government overseeing the deployment. So some sort of sense of managed deployment of automated vehicles based on safety assurance, knowing that those vehicles will operate safely. And really one of the factors here as to where governments land on this is to say, well, what's the risk appetite of the general community? If our risk appetite is high and we're prepared to accept that there will be some safety risks, industry self-regulation might be most appropriate. And it's worth bearing in mind that when we say industry self-regulation, we are saying that with a safety net in place, which are the Australian design rules, road rules, product liability, consumer law. So it's not just laissez-faire industry self-regulation without any safety net there.
Great. And James, I think you might have answered one of our questions, which is about protecting the public. So the question from John, thank you John, as is often the case, the proponents of technology are pushing this technology for their gain. Who are the experts protecting the public at large?
That's exactly right, and I think that's really the question we're grappling with. Does there need to be a role for government here, say, for example, around the certification of vehicles or the testing of vehicles, in the same way that today we test you before we let you out on the road, we give you a driving licence. So it's the equivalent of a driving licence for the automated driving system. That's a key issue. The other issue that I'm grappling with is the issue of, well, there always needs to be someone legally responsible for that vehicle, because at the end of the day, an automated vehicle, it's just a computer, and a computer cannot be held accountable for the road rules, compliance with the road rules, not to mention criminal law and civil law. So that's very important to think about as well, and ensuring that we might have a mechanism to ensure that we always do have a legal entity responsible for the vehicle.
And I think you've got some slides coming up for John's next question, which was what measures are being used to compare/accept the safety performance of automated vehicles, fatal, serious, minor injury, PDO crashes per 100 kilometres.
So if that's a question about how we test safety, how we measure safety, there's clearly a couple of ways that we can do that. So clearly you could go down the Google path and test millions of miles of of kilometres of the vehicle in different conditions, hopefully in different conditions over time, or you can say, well, let's set up behavioural competency tests and say, can the vehicle perform and meet the required road rules? Say, for example, the road rule to give way. Does it give way safely? So you could take a behavioural competency test approach, but certainly those issues do need to be resolved. There's absolutely no doubt about that.
Great. And just this might be one for Jerome from Ben. I see parallels with system safety from aviation. How much has NTC been looking at leveraging the experience and knowledge from the aviation industry?
I can actually. I will say hold that thought, because I do start talking about the aviation industry in a couple of slides.
Awesome, thank you.
And we'll just make a point to Ben. Our very first webinar for AVI was actually on Flight Safety Foundation talking about it all as well. So we can certainly send through a link to where that webinar is held as well.
Great, thanks.
Okay, so let's now turn our minds to the regulatory options. And as I said, this really is the core area that we'd like some feedback on. The first issue that we're contemplating is how should governments support nationally consistent on-road trials? And some of you might dispute whether that question is even valid, and that's certainly fair enough as well. So do we need consistent trials between, say, Victoria and New South Wales? How much is that really a problem for industry, or does it matter terribly if, for example, there's particular rules around insurance, driver training, the data that needs to be provided to the road agency? Does it matter if they're different between states? What we've heard so far from industry is that there is a preference for nationally consistent guidelines, but that certainly is a challenge in a federation like Australia. The other challenge we have is, of course, that the processes, the exemption, the process to be granted an exemption does also vary between road agencies as well, and there's a cost factor there. But we think this is really an important issue. We've seen the United Kingdom, New Zealand, and now Japan take the lead in this space, introducing codes of practice or national guidelines, and we're very interested in that. But that also means there's already a plethora of choice out there as to what you want to put into the guidelines. So we do think this is worth looking at. We've got 4 options up there. Option 1 is we simply continue the current approach, and every jurisdiction relies on their own exemption powers granted on a case-by-case basis. And remember, this is really very much about trialling and testing automated vehicles. We're not talking about large-scale commercial deployment. Potentially niche deployment, but I suspect it wouldn't be much use beyond that as a regulatory framework. Option 2 is the same, but you'd support it with industry development of a code of practice to undertake on-road trials. Option 3 is, again, continue the current approach, but introduce national guidelines to support a consistent approach to on-road trials. And then option 4 is the development of uniform legislation to support trials applied in state and territory road laws. We think that option 3 sits at about the right place. Love to get your feedback on that. Option 3 because it's the road agencies that have to set the guidelines. It's their network. It's not the industry's network, so it does feel that it makes sense that it's the road agencies that would lead on this with input from industry rather than the other way around. The issue with option 4 is that it's likely to take some years, and we need to be flexible, we need to be nimble. Western Australian RAC, the Royal Automobile Club over there, has already announced they're launching a trial the next year or so for passenger shuttles. We know there's a lot of work going on to develop trials and demonstrations around Australia, so we think this is probably it's important that we act now and in a flexible and nimble way. So
South Australia's obviously had their trials that took place in November, and they had some quite leading legislation come through to mobilise them in the future. Where would they sort of sit? Option 3?
So South Australia has introduced, since that demonstration, South Australia has introduced its own legislation to enable trials, and we think that makes sense because then you can have very clear powers in which to grant the exemption specifically for automated vehicles. And that's fine. In a way, it doesn't really matter. If you look at option 3, it doesn't really matter what legal framework each state and territory has, whether it's in the Road Safety Act or whatever their legislation is. The point is that even in South Australia, the legislation refers back to ministerial guidelines. So it's about the consistent guidelines applied in each state. Doesn't necessarily have to be the same legal framework. And that leads us to the next question, and thank you for the aviation comment, because this is really key to this issue, and that is control. Who controls the vehicle? Or should I say who or what is in control of an automated vehicle? And we think that this is a pressing issue for industry and regulators. And when I say industry, I mean not only automobile manufacturers and technology providers, but also the insurance industry. So what level of automation is the vehicle capable of is, we think, the first question here. And you will see along that second top bar, we've got the levels of automation. Partial, which is where, a bit like advanced cruise control, what Tesla has now with lane keeping abilities and lane changing functions, but there's only 1 or 2 applications, and overall you would say it is a manual vehicle with some driver's assistance, driver aid. And then we think in that situation it's pretty clear that the human driver is in control. Likewise, we also think if you look at the other end of the scale, fully automated, it's pretty clear that the vehicle's automated with the human not in the loop, and therefore the automated driving system entity is in control. Notice we don't say the system, but the system entity. So we think that's pretty clear. And we also, surprisingly, think, given the structure there, it looks a bit complex for high, but surprisingly we actually do think it's pretty clear, if you follow the SAE standard, that in a highly automated vehicle, the human driver is only in control when the automated vehicle is in manual mode, if the vehicle has manual mode. Otherwise, it's the automated driving system entity that's in control. I haven't got into too much detail today because of time about the differences between different types of highly automated vehicles, but the discussion paper does get into a lot of detail about that. And if anyone has a comment, I'm happy to get into that into a little bit more detail. But it's effectively, there's 2 types of highly automated. There's a highly automated that is fully automated but limited in where it can go, and then there's the highly automated some of the time but can go anywhere else at a lower level of automation. Happy to unpack that a little bit more later on. In terms of what is an issue for control, is that it's conditionally automated, and the problem is that, or the complexity is that in a conditionally automated vehicle there is still a role for the human driver, and that role is not to undertake the driving task, and it is not to monitor the driving environment, but it's to monitor the driving system and to be fallback if something goes wrong or if requested by the system. So the sensors stop working because there's a blizzard, the human driver is there to take back control. Whereas in a highly automated vehicle, by definition, there's a blizzard, the sensors fail, the vehicle comes to a safe stop on its own. So there doesn't have to be a human driver alert and ready to take back control, or indeed a driver at all. So conditionally automated is complex. We think that if you look at aviation, the co-pilot, autopilot in a plane aircraft today is effectively conditionally automated, in the sense that the pilot is responsible for the vehicle, the aircraft, and the industry has been very clear and consistent that the pilot, the human, remains in control of that aircraft and responsible for the aircraft, no matter what. So that's one precedent, one approach that we could take, and we're looking at that very carefully. And others are around the world. The challenge there, though, if you think about it, it means that The human driver can be driving along the vehicle, the sensors could fail, and the vehicle could fail to stop at a stop sign, and you, the human driver, are not even required to look out the windscreen and notice there was a stop sign. Now, the community might feel that in that situation, is it really fair to say I'm in control here? It's a difficult one. They're responsible for looking at the dashboard to notice there's a problem with the system and that the sensors failed. So you can see that there's a complexity there. We also, obviously, there are a lot of safety issues with conditionally automated as well, in their relationship between the human and the machine, ensuring the driver remains alert and ready to take back control. And that's certainly an issue that that others are looking at. And then we have this slide, and this is a subset, a secondary issue to control. So let's imagine that we've resolved the conditionally automated vehicle issue, and we've said the driver's in control. Then the question is, if the police officer sees this at the side of the road, how does he treat that from a legal perspective? Does this driver have proper control? And it's italicised because it's a term in the road rules, which comes from the Australian Road Rule 297, and it effectively says just that the driver must have proper control of the vehicle. But it doesn't define driver, and it doesn't define proper control. And we'll deal with driver in a moment. Proper control, if we look at the dictionary definition, it is just that. It doesn't say that it needs to be one hand on the wheel or the driver sitting behind the driver's seat, but that's how it's interpreted by the police. And because that's how it's interpreted, unless it goes through the court process and there's a judgment on it, that's what we have for the moment. So the police officer would look at that today and say, no, the driver doesn't have control. If it's an automated vehicle, the correct question would then be, well, is it a highly automated vehicle or is it a conditionally automated vehicle? And then if it's highly, you'd suggest maybe it is, and that's a Volvo car, which is being promoted as a highly automated vehicle for their Gothenburg trial next year. But if it's conditional, the question then is, well, you have to monitor the vehicle, the driving system. So what's appropriate? What are we going to let drivers do in that situation? They don't have to hold the steering wheel, but do they have to remain alert? And remember, this could be for 8 hours on the drive from Melbourne to Sydney on the Hume. So there's going to be some real challenges there.
So just two quick questions here, if you don't mind, James. I think it's a good option, and I think one of them you've answered. So, Christian, please let us know whether you're happy with the answer around whether James has ticked off around how do automated cars fit within the current legal road rules. I think you probably just ticked that off just then. Would you agree?
Yes, and I will touch on it a little bit later with driver definition. Yeah.
The other one, and this is a really good one from John, is around, has there been an assessment for consumer appetite for fully automated vehicles? Because we've got a picture of the person sitting there, so would you provide some thoughts around that?
Yes, there's quite a lot of studies being undertaken, a lot of focus groups. The Transport Forum, International Transport Forum, which is part of the OECD, they've undertaken a lot of work. The US DOT has undertaken a lot of work, less in Australia. So that's a potential area there for further research in Australia around appetite for automated vehicles. What's interesting about if you read the literature, what's really interesting is preferences change. They tend to change with demographics. So the older you are, the less likely you are to want an automated vehicle. I haven't seen any changes based on sex. That would be interesting to look at. But certainly the younger the people are, they tend to be more interested in automated vehicles. But what is consistent across the board, and I think this is so important, people get the benefits. They understand intuitively, with very little prompting in focus groups, they come to very similar conclusions that you or I might come to after some significant thought. So benefits around safety, around mobility, particularly mobility, people do understand the benefits there of automated vehicles. So I think that's a good start, but if you look at the media, you can see trending now. The initial excitement about automated vehicles is passing. Now they're beginning to ask the difficult questions, the complexities around safety, and particularly the HMI issues and cybersecurity.
Geez, we're getting a lot of questions coming in, I'll tell you. And I will also let you know, James, that as we go along, there's going to be a SRG, which is another arm of ADVI, will be doing the longitudinal sort of surveys of attitudes within Australia as well.
That's great. Thanks, Jerome. So I will try and press on, but I really like the questions, so please keep them coming, because that really is that's great for me.
We've got lots,
We have lots of them.
there, so we'll let you deliver a bit more
right.
of your wisdom, and then we'll...
Okay.
Yeah.
So control. How do we clarify control? We're saying that there are 3 ways we can do it. We can continue the current approach, let industry develop its position on the meaning of control and proper control, and test the concept in the courts. Governments, alternatively, could develop national enforcement guidelines to clarify a policy position on the meaning of control, or we could amend Australian road rules and state and territory traffic laws to clarify the meaning of control and proper control, and that could be done through examples in regs. But we're suggesting option 2 is a good start, and national guidelines, which we have the police, which we would have the police involved in, could be very principles-based and enable us to at least start thinking about automated vehicles from a policy perspective. So a couple of questions around control, how you think control should be defined. We're interested in your views on that in the submission process, and what role should governments have to clarify control. So they're 2 key issues that we're interested in. I'd now like to turn your mind to really that issue of driver licensing, and particularly for highly automated or those vehicles that don't have a human driver in the loop. So if you ask yourself, what safety assurance do we have for vehicles that do not require a human driver? We've got vehicle certification and Australian design rules, and with that, in-service vehicle standards. Then we also have vehicle registration, which is making sure that they're consistent at point of sale or annually, depending which jurisdiction you're in. If you look at the levels of automation, we think that continues to work for partial and conditional, and those highly automated vehicles that still have a human driver some of the time, because they will have human driver licensing to operate that vehicle based on a vehicle class. The issue then is, as I said earlier, do we need an automated driving system entity licensed to operate the vehicle for those higher levels of automation? And we actually think, and this is very much a first cut, and we've put some options in for discussion purposes, but we actually think yes, we probably do, particularly at this early stage where the safety risks are yet to be determined, and you've also got to appreciate that there's not just one type of automated vehicle being developed. There's potentially hundreds, so there's going to be a diversity, a complexity. You could remove the barriers, thinking that vehicle A is going to come in, but actually vehicle B, C, and D could too. And if that's an issue for the community and the safe network operations, then that's a concern. So option 1 is really we remove the barriers and let industry get on with it with the current framework, so ADRs and so forth. Option 2 is we implement some sort of national safety assurance framework to oversee the deployment of automated vehicles. That assurance framework is a concept. What it looks like in reality really could be anything. It could be accreditation of the operator, it could be licensing of the operator, or it could be part of the registration process. In the discussion paper, we've put together a bunch of criteria that we think could be used by road agencies. Again, it's a straw man. We're interested in your views on that. But we think this is your opportunity, you as in governments, to determine what an automated vehicle needs to be safe. And that could be things like that behavioural competency concept. So demonstrate to us that the vehicle can meet all the requirements of the road rules. Demonstrate to us that there is a robust, safe human-machine interface for vehicles so that people aren't falling asleep. There are vigilance controls for the vehicle. Demonstrate to us that there is a legal entity that is going to be responsible for this vehicle and that can be sued in Australia. And that's very important as well. So you know, it's a company that is incorporated in Australia, has the data in Australia, can be accessed in Australia, sued in Australia. We think that's going to be very important from a legal perspective. So the beauty of this approach is you can put anything in that criteria as long as you're open about it, transparent, and demonstrate the importance and the necessity of that. We think that that's probably warranted for highly automated vehicles, and isn't more red tape or more regulation because, as I said earlier, there may not be that driving license requirement. So big questions there. Should governments oversee the safe operation of automated vehicles? If so, at what level of automation? And certainly this is something that NHTSA in the United States, the responsible regulator there, is contemplating, as are various member states and the European Commission. So we're not alone in thinking about this, but to my knowledge, no one has come to a conclusive answer. And I think ultimately every country will have to decide for itself what level of regulation it needs for automated vehicles, certainly at this early stage. You might have seen some headlines a couple of weeks ago, 716 provisions identified by the NTC as potential barriers to automated vehicles. That's a lot of provisions. It does include a couple of international conventions as well as the Australian design rules, road rules, and a whole bunch of other laws, tolling legislation, criminal law, passenger transport law. The issue primarily that's a problem or a potential barrier is this concept of driver. And the problem is that the current laws effectively assume that the driver's human. And it's anthropological. I mean, you look at the road rules. It talks about a lap, it talks about the vision, the sight of the driver. It has requirements to extend one's arm if the indicator fails. There is no doubt in my mind that it's intended to be a human. The problem then is, well, all the road rules the mechanics of the road rules are that it's the driver that's responsible for meeting the obligations of the road rules, not the vehicle. So if the driver is only a human, then the road rules cannot be applied to an automated vehicle without a human in it, or that doesn't have a highly automated vehicle or a fully automated vehicle, and that's a problem. We also have heavy vehicle national law, other road safety laws where there are requirements on the driver that aren't related to the driving task. So, for example, a truck driver has to be able to hand over to a police officer declarations around MDL, mass dimension loading of the vehicle. Likewise, you as a driver are required by law to stop and give assistance in the case of an injured person after a crash. How does that work with automated vehicles? Now, some of those issues, it might be a case of another entity takes responsibility, so it's the operator that takes responsibility for those mass dimension loading requirements, and there could be a technology solution for some of those other issues, say for example e-call, if there's an emergency call is made automatically by the vehicle if there's been a crash. So we think that it's manageable, but potentially quite a lot of work for the states and territories and the Commonwealth to deal with this. It also includes vehicle standards as well, so that's an issue.
And we actually have a good point here. I'll just sort of a bit of a segue in there. Obviously, we've heard about road rules and standards and those sort of parts, but there's a question here from Colin. Has there any consideration been given on the infrastructure standards that might be needed to facilitate these vehicles in the road network, and what implications these would also have on the road authorities?
Yes, so that's an Austroads project that's specifically looking at that issue. And that's so NTC is looking specifically at the regulatory policy issues, and Austroads has a suite of 3 projects which they have contracted out to various companies, looking at safety benefits of automated vehicles, looking at registration and licensing processes, so how registration and licensing might change. You can see clear connection there between that project and ours, and we're working very closely with Austroads. And the 3rd project is looking at network, the impact of automated vehicles and CRTS on networks. So the answer, of course, is we don't know, because we don't know which types of automated vehicles are going to be introduced in Australia, but we can make some really good estimates, and we can say, well, if it's a particular type of automated vehicle, say for example one that uses vehicle-to-vehicle infrastructure or vehicle-to-infrastructure technology, CITS, that there is going to be some infrastructure requirements. So the clarifying the concept of driver is probably the key largest regulatory barrier to automated vehicles, highly automated vehicles. Less so any automated vehicle that still has a driver in the loop, probably not. But for those more advanced vehicles, absolutely, we have a potential issue there. In the meantime, and this is option 1, we can continue the current approach. We can rely on exemptions granted on a case-by-case basis. But we support option 2 at this stage. We think that certainly by the medium term, we're going to have to amend the definition of driver in legislation. And what we're proposing is that we expand the definition of driver rather than add or replace driver with operator, because we think operator is a term already used in several ways in the law, and we think this is probably the neatest and simplest approach. And by expanding the meaning of driver, we would say that we would include an automated driving system and the legal entity responsible for that system. And then, so that's almost the easy bit. That's just done in the definition section of the laws. But then we have to go through line by line the legislation and say, well, here's a duty of the driver. How do we address that for automated vehicles? Can that stay? Is it relevant? Or does it have to be adapted? So, for example, that heavy vehicle example, we could change that to operator. Likewise, for fatigue and alcohol offences, we could clarify when it's relevant or otherwise. Thanks. So, questions to think about. Should governments expand the meaning of driver in legislation? And what responsibilities should the automated vehicle entity have? And what responsibilities should be attributed to others?
I've got a bit of a segue question here for you from Tanya. I think it feeds in nicely on this at the moment. Do you think there's a difference between, 1, being in proper control for the purposes of the road rules, and 2, taking responsible care for the purpose of determining whether a driver is negligent in the event of an incident?
They're definitely linked. I like to keep it separate. I think proper control is a test for the road rules, but would very much influence the mind of the judge as to who was responsible for an accident. So I think they are linked, but the tests are slightly different. So the test in tort law, for example, is one of duty of care and negligence. The issue here is really about the vehicle having proper control. But if there has been an accident because the driver failed to have proper control, well then prima facie in my mind, you've got evidence for both an infringement of the road rules and also from a liability insurance perspective.
So you could work back on a sort of mutual recognition.
I guess, I mean, it really is, in my mind, it is separate. They are separate concepts. Proper control is a very interesting, it's not prescribed, there's no prescription around what it means. So it's a bit like give way. If you think about it, the law doesn't say, all it says is you have to give way to oncoming traffic. It doesn't say by how many metres. And proper control is a little bit the same. It's proven in the breach. The police officer can prove you didn't have proper control because you hit a tree. The police officer can prove you didn't give way because you hit an oncoming car. So the answer to proper control may be that there's less focus on that roadside enforcement perspective and identifying behaviours that are unacceptable, and maybe more of a focus on the outcome.
So unacceptable, for example, a question here raised by Carolyn, is looking at the police enforce control as one hand on the wheel. Where does that come from? Is that case law?
Well, that's right. It doesn't come from case law. It comes from enforcement guidelines, except in Western Australia.
Really?
Where it is prescribed in the law. But that's precisely why we're suggesting guidelines is the appropriate approach, and not to change the law, because we think the law, it's performance-based, it's pretty good. It's tackling the issue at that level of enforcement is probably, or possibly, a way to go. And that leads actually very nicely to the next issue, which is identifying responsibility for a vehicle. And this is really about data. So if you think about an automated vehicle that switches automation between a driver, a human driver, and the driving system, say for example it's a regular car and then you get onto the freeway and you can put it into autopilot mode, the question for police will be, well, how do I know that you're in A, that you're in an automated vehicle, and B, that it's in automated vehicle mode at the time of an offence or at a given time. And this is also going to be an issue for liability, but as I said, I do like to keep liability separate, and it is separated out in this discussion paper. From the enforcement perspective, there's a few ways we can tackle this issue. One is that we could actually just continue the current approach. So if I'm caught in a camera offence and it's not my vehicle, and the vehicle owner fills out a stat deck, as I'm sure many of you would be familiar with, that it was me and not you, and send it into the police, and it's done and dusted. That could continue today. So the onus, the deemed liability, is on you, the registered owner, or if you're caught on the side of the road, the driver, and then the registered owner would then pass that on to the, in this case, it would be the driving system entity, and ensure the driving system entity then pays the fine. The issue, of course, is that I, as the driver, don't necessarily have the data at hand, and am not necessarily in a strong position to get the accurate data. So there are additional steps there to prove who was responsible for a vehicle at a given time. So we think, there could be other ways. Option 2, enforcement agencies could collaborate with industry to develop technology interfaces that enable police to identify AVs and who are responsible for that vehicle at a given time. Or option 3, we could flip it. We could flip that onus and that deemed liability and put it on the automated driving system entity. And I can't help thinking that in the longer run that makes sense. If the vehicle is going to be in automated mode most of the time, and the driving system entity has the data at hand, then maybe in the longer term that could be the approach. But certainly for now, we think that option 1 probably makes sense until the market matures and the technology matures. And the technology interface, certainly in the longer run, in the medium term, would certainly make sense as well. And that leads us to vehicle design and standards. And the question here is, how should governments approach the issue of vehicle standards for highly automated vehicles? So if you look at a shuttle pod or something like that, EasyMile, Navia, 2 great examples there. There's no steering wheel, no steering column, no driver's seat, no dashboard, no rearview mirror. You understand. Clearly, we have a problem from the ADR perspective. The good news is that many other countries around the world are aware of this, and I'm confident that UNECE standards, regulations will be updated over time. Australia, it's Commonwealth government policy. Australia is consistent in its ADRs with international vehicle standards, European standards, and that's certainly the strong preference of the auto manufacturers. So I would be very surprised if that was to change, and I think really that means that we will have to rely on the current approach in the meantime, which are exemptions, until international standards are developed. On the other hand, though, it's probably not such a huge challenge or an issue because I don't think we're going to see large-scale commercial deployment of passenger shuttles or completely highly automated pods for a long time to come. And if it was to be introduced as a form of passenger transport, I'd consider that very niche deployment, and again, quite possibly could be used within the exemption framework. But that's my view, and it'd be great to get people's views on that. Option 2 is that we do adopt new ADRs now that support highly and fully automated vehicles. We think that's probably going too soon. We think that it's uncertain at this stage what should be in those ADRs. There's a few things we contemplate in the paper. We think that ADRs, future ADRs, might not just remove the steering column and braking pedals and rear-view mirrors for automated vehicles, but could actually stipulate security requirements, cybersecurity requirements, communications protocols, data protections, and so forth. But yeah, have to ask yourself at the end of the day, if we are in a future with highly automated vehicles, do we need ADRs at all? And that's certainly something you'd have to wonder about in the longer term. Are the road rules enough? Particularly if we're in a situation where there's only a handful of operators and no one's driving, we might see a much more integrated transport network where a very different approach could be taken. But that's much further down the track, I suspect.
Well, and I think that's a good question. We've got one here from Ro, for example, who actually asks, do you have any views on whether the introduction of high to fully automated vehicles will also affect the laws governing the use of standard vehicles? So if we entered that world, will that flow backwards and impact on existing vehicles?
I don't know if it's going to impact vehicle standards. I suspect it'll impact driving licensing requirements. I think we're going to have to learn how to navigate and drive around and with automated vehicles because I think we're going to have mixed traffic for some time to come.
So you're going to see a tiered sort of licensing system. If you get a highly automated vehicle, for example, like a bit of, I guess, an automatic versus manual driving.
Well, I'd be very interested to see what Austroads comes out with this year on that very issue. And that leads us to vehicle modification, and I'll go through this quite quickly because we do only have 9 minutes or so left, and as you can see, there's a lot of material. So vehicle modification is the question of, well, if there's no human driver in the loop, vehicle sensors are going to be absolutely critical, so do we have to regulate vehicle modification and in-service compliance? It has happened in the past. Governments have overseen or licensed mechanics to convert air conditioning units from CFCs, but that's quite a significant change to the current approach. So we could just carry on and rely on in-vehicle service standards. We could support industry development of modification standards in FCAI, have a repairer's code, could be an adaptation of that. Or option 3, we could develop national legislation to administer an automated licensing modification regime. But we think that's probably a little bit heavy touch at this stage, and we're suggesting option 2 is a good approach. Liability, I will try and sum up liability as quickly as I can. In short, liability is going to be complex, but we think that the current liability framework in Australia is robust, and we think that it's been developed over many hundreds of years. We have it in common law, we have consumer law. We think that liability can be managed with automated vehicles. Having said that, the issue is going to be, the key issue for liability is going to be data and accessing that data to process claims swiftly, efficiently, cost-effectively, and fairly and accurately. That's probably going to be the biggest issue. We can continue the current approach and rely on insurance and other entities to cooperate in the interests of their customers to ensure that liability issues can be resolved on a case-by-case basis. There could be a role, option 2, there could be a role for governments to support the development of industry guidance including information about liability and education campaigns. So we could work together really to try and unpack the issues and provide some guidance to the industry. And then there's option 3. And option 3 is the legislative approach. And there are 4, there's 3A, 3B, 3C, 3D, and they're all different. They're all tackling different issues related to liability. So you could pick them off, you could do some of them, you could do none of them, all of them. The first one is about clarifying legal liability for automated vehicle parties in the law, looking at that who's prima facie responsible for the vehicle. That could change over time for highly automated vehicles. That could be something worth doing. 3B, regulate third-party access to automated vehicle event data, ensuring that the event data is not only provided in a consistent way, but also in a format that makes sense to the receiver. 3C, harmonise road manager liability provisions. So all the states have different types of liability. Some have it, it's very difficult to sue. Some states, other states it's impossible. South Australia, you can't do it. So that means if there is a network requirement for the states to provide infrastructure to support automated vehicles, is the fact that they can't be sued in South Australia a barrier to industry going ahead and deploying automated vehicles? Interesting question. 3D, address compulsory third-party insurance issues and potential barriers, and that's really about the fact that you need a driver to be eligible for third-party insurance compensation in many states, and that's clearly going to be a problem. So they're the 4 areas. Some of those might be more pressing than others. At this stage, we support option 2. I'll go back, which is about industry guidance on liability, but very open to discussing these really important issues. And I'm going to finish on privacy. So how should governments support the protection of personal information? The issue with privacy is we don't yet know the extent to which automated vehicles will generate personal information, which could include location information. And we don't know because we don't know what the mix of technologies will be. So some technologies will generate personal information. If that's the case, the question is, how do we manage that privacy risk? Now today, many of us have smartphones and the risk of generating personal information, location information, is very high, and people don't seem to care. That's fine for smartphones, but human nature being what it is, it's quite possible that it will be an issue when they're in their car. So it's a perception, it's a community risk, and it could be a real risk to the uptake of automated vehicles, and that's a problem if they do have the safety benefits that we think they do have. So we're saying we can continue to regulate it through the Australian privacy principles, or governments and industry could develop best practice guidance for automated vehicles, or governments could legislate access to automated vehicle data. And that's a real option. A couple of years ago, transport ministers around Australia agreed that if cooperative intelligent transport systems data did turn out to be personal information, that they would introduce legislation to ensure that police could only access that data with a judicial warrant. So it really is following that similar line of thinking there. But at this stage, as I said, it's last in the slides, the timing, because we still don't know yet what risk of privacy there is there. So yeah, what are the issues or barriers that need to be addressed, and what's the role of government? What issues should government prioritise are really the key issues there. And in the interests of time, I might just quickly dash through the timing. This one will only take a minute, and then I'd love to have some more discussion. So we're saying in the near term, we think trials and clarifying who or what is in control of the vehicle is an issue, and they're both issues that should be addressed as soon as possible, so next year. Issues around the driving, licensing, the meaning of driver in legislation and interaction with enforcement, medium-term reforms, maybe commence within 2 years, acknowledging there's a lag, especially for national reforms, So even medium term is still quite soon. Longer term reforms more about the vehicle standards, given those issues with the UN regulations I mentioned earlier, so maybe commence reforms within 3 to 5 years, and clarify and then refine, so have those issues around vehicle modification, liability, privacy, commence reforms as required as we understand more. The point here is that we're suggesting a roadmap, a reform pipeline, so that we don't do everything now. We think it needs to be staged, phased, because we don't yet know what direction the technology is going to be going and how the market will mature. So interested also in your view on our assumptions about the pace of change and whether you agree that with the timing and the sequence of proposed reforms.
Those questions to think about are awesome because it stimulates thought, and that's what you're wanting, isn't it, James?
Yes.
And if everyone's sort of happy, we might just run just 4 or 5 minutes over. It's not very often you get actually deluged with the number of questions we've actually received. So thank you very much to the audience. And what we can now delve into is actually ask just a couple of questions if people don't mind us running over a little bit.
Great. So, Jerome, do you feel free to move the mouse now because we're not using the PowerPoint. So have you got a question there that you were...
Let me see, we want here, let's see, we've got, is there a need to have a national consistency regarding detection and penalties for unauthorised modifications of automated functions?
That's the key question, really, for modification. So if you go back to that, it's that last option. If we were to have a regulatory scheme to manage modification, with that necessarily comes penalties, offences and penalties, or else it wouldn't be useful. So yes, I think that's if we go down that path of regulating modification, that would be necessary. It wouldn't have to be necessarily a monetary penalty. It could be withdrawal of your licence to undertake the modification.
I like this one here. But if we rely on the existing regimes, this could lead to a patchwork system operating nationally, some states requiring liability to be proved, others not. Thoughts?
Yeah, so I think that's right. If we existing regimes, I'm interested whether the view there is around specifically for insurance and liability, but absolutely, that's really what the NTC is focused on. Where possible, we're always going to have state-based regimes, but whether they can be as consistent as possible is really our objective here.
We had a question from Avis earlier. Does this mean that police will have to upgrade their accident investigation competencies and methods?
It does. Well, probably. The identifying the automated vehicle on the road could be a visual sign. So the police have even themselves suggested a flashing light or a sign of some description. So, but I suspect that's correct, Avis. And I also think in the longer run, you'd want to think about whether the balance between roadside enforcement and back office audit and investigation might also change. So if we're no longer driving and it's a network approach with only a handful of operators managing the road network, operations, you might start to think to yourself, well, do we need a police officer out there on the side of the road flagging vehicles down and checking that they're compliant? You don't see too many policemen checking the speed of trains as they go by, or indeed an aeroplane. So it's really all about, do we need to move away from that prescriptive roadside enforcement approach to rules? Do we need that road rules approach? Or in the longer term, and I really do mean that longer term, do we need, or would we be serviced much better by a safety management approach?
And this is, I think, James has actually made a good point here as well. A better alternative may be that ADRs are sufficient in specifying a safe automated vehicle and no road rules are required.
Yeah, that's right. So earlier I posited the idea that we could have no ADRs and just road rules. You could flip that and just have ADRs. But I think if you remove the road rules, you do need some sort of mechanism, and I'd suggest something such as accreditation in the way that we accredit rail operators to operate on the network. I still think you need something there.
And here's probably just a good clarifying one. What role does Australian standards play, in particular reviewing and endorsing other international system standards, such as those from the European Standards Commission and ISO?
Yeah, so that's going to be, in the future, that's clearly going to be very important. I suspect particularly around cybersecurity and data. The challenge we have, though, is that we don't yet, okay, if you look at CITS and the development of CITS, you've seen thoughtful, methodical process in place to develop international standards for security of CITS. So that's intelligent transport systems. We've seen it coming for many years. That's not the case for automated vehicles. 3 or 4 years ago, no one was talking about automated vehicles, and it's really come out of nowhere. So we have we really do have a gap at the moment in the standard space, and that I think is going to be a real focus. Even just the standards around assessing the safety of automated vehicles, specific standards rather than the principle-based standards that we have now in ISO standards.
And I think we'll probably just have to call it quits. One last question, and I'm very sorry if we didn't get to all your questions because there are so many here. In Queensland, according to the Acts Interpretation Act of 1954, a reference to a person generally includes a reference to a corporation as well as an individual. Would this satisfy the legal entity issue?
Not if that corporation has a hand. Doesn't have a hand. I'm being flippant. I think I think it depends on the circumstances with which you are intending to use that provision. So I think at times that's going to be absolutely fine. So if it's an obligation to provide records or to meet a requirement of the rule set, that's fine. But there will be other requirements in the road rules that simply don't make sense if they were a corporation.
Great.
Thank you very much, James.
That's a great.
It's an absolute pleasure.
That's a great message to finish on, and thank you so much for telling us all about the awesome complexities involved in keeping us safe in this new topic.
It's an absolute pleasure, and just to remind everyone, 4th of July, and we'd love to get your views in a submission to the National Transport Commission. So thank you very much.
Thank you.